Hey guys, tonight we ease into candlelit halls where powdered wigs brush against frescoed ceilings and every fork, spoon, and sigh is loaded with meaning. You're about to tiptoe behind the golden chairs of monarchs who looked regal in portraits, but when the soup course came, turned into the kind of guests you'd regret inviting. You smell roasted pheasants and spiced wine thick in the air, and yet all you can think about is whether you're holding the wrong spoon. And let's be honest, if you had to keep track of 15 different forks while balancing the weight of a crown, you'd probably fling the napkin into someone's lap too. You probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I'm curious how far across the map these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lower yourself onto a velvet-backed chair, and there it begins. The most awkward dinner of your life. The silver glimmers, the chandeliers blaze, and across from you sits a king who just dropped his spoon into the tureen. The whole table freezes for a breath, and then, pretending nothing happened, servants scramble to replace the utensil as though it had vanished into thin air. But you catch the smirk of a duchess who definitely saw. This was not a rare event. Royal banquets were spectacles, yes, but also minefields of etiquette. One mainstream historical fact. Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, made dining into a ritual where the order of who stood, who sat, and who dared chew at which moment signaled status. But behind all that pomp, slips were constant. People bit into cherries and sprayed juice across lace collars, or got their sleeves caught in gravy boats. Imagine a multi-million-dollar gala where someone's elbow tips into the chocolate fountain. Same vibe, just with more powdered wigs. Now picture a fringe tidbit. At one Tudor feast, a noble tried so hard to follow the rules of not blowing his nose into the tablecloth that he ended up sneezing straight into the king's cup. Servants whisked it away instantly, but word spread faster than plague gossip. Historians still argue whether the monarch genuinely laughed it off or secretly blacklisted that poor man forever. And you, stuck between knife and goblet, realize how cruelly silent those rooms could be. Every cough echoes. Every clatter of a dropped fork becomes thunder. One Spanish queen famously endured the shame of having a piece of roast pigeon tumble right out of her mouth mid-sentence, rolling dramatically across her plate like a miniature cannonball. Guests froze, as if the very future of alliances depended on pretending they hadn't seen it. You shift in your chair, imagining the terror of chewing too loudly. These were centuries when etiquette manuals warned that to crunch bread audibly is to insult God's patience. No pressure, right? At one banquet in Vienna, a visiting prince's stomach growled so fiercely between courses that the host quickly ordered music to cover it. But the strings came in too late, and the hall shook with giggles. If you've ever had your stomach roar during a silent exam, you know the pain. Multiply that by royal politics. Let's not forget spilled wine. It stained silk, ruined embroidery, and symbolically ruined evenings. A German duke once knocked an entire goblet over the visiting Swedish ambassador, who sat dripping red like a sacrificed chicken. The duke tried to dab at him with his lace cuff, which only made things worse. You can almost hear the muttered, it's fine," in several languages, while everyone prayed the treaty negotiations wouldn't collapse over grape juice. One joke hides itself in the menu. Peacocks roasted with feathers reattached for show. Impressive, but the bones were impossible to eat politely. More than one king gnawed like a terrier behind his handkerchief, hoping nobody noticed. Spoiler, they noticed. And in case you feel superior with your plastic cutlery skills, just remember, some of these people fainted from corsets while trying to swallow a dumpling. You at least get elastic waistbands. You lean back, picturing candle wax dripping down onto polished tables. Somewhere, a lady-in-waiting discreetly pushes a fallen bread roll back onto a plate. Somewhere else, a monarch pretends not to notice that he's chewing parsley that's stuck on his mustache, and the silence grows heavier with each course. Historians still debate whether these little humiliations mattered politically, or whether courts quietly understood everyone was human beneath brocade. Some argue an embarrassed king lost influence. Others claim the humor broke tension. What's certain is that behind every polished painting of serene monarchs, there's an invisible moment when someone's wig caught soup steam and curled like wet laundry. And as you finally set down your imaginary fork, you're glad no one is watching you. Because in those rooms, even the tiniest slip, like dropping your napkin, was enough to make you the star of gossip until the next poor soul sneezed at the wrong time. You shuffle forward in the long corridor, the smell of beeswax and damp stone following you into yet another gilded chamber. This time there is no soup to navigate, no dripping candle to stain your sleeve. Instead, you're about to extend your hand, hoping not to ruin an entire alliance with one sweaty grip. Yes, the handshake, or in royal terms, the greeting ritual, could decide whether you walked away with a treaty or a centuries-long grudge. You picture the moment. A king stands before you, rings glinting, eyes sharp. You lean forward, arms slightly too stiff, and then you realize, oh no, you've gone for a handshake when he expected a bow. Welcome to the handshake of doom. A mainstream fact anchors you. Queen Elizabeth I famously used handshakes sparingly, preferring controlled curtsies or symbolic touches, because even physical contact implied favor or hierarchy. Yet as centuries shifted and handshakes became fashionable among diplomats, rulers stumbled over how hard to squeeze, how long to hold, or which cultural nuance to remember. Now imagine the cringe when Catherine the Great greeted a visiting envoy by grasping his hand enthusiastically, only to realize he expected her to kiss his glove instead. His expression froze between insulted and terrified, while courtiers whispered furiously about whether the faux pas meant war. Historians still argue whether Catherine did it deliberately to test his composure or genuinely forgot the script. And sometimes the grip itself betrayed rulers. One French king, Louis XV, had such a limp handshake that foreign dignitaries privately joked they couldn't tell if he was alive. Others went the opposite way. Peter the Great was known for bone-crushing shakes, leaving ambassadors nursing bruised knuckles. You can almost hear the awkward laughter. "Ha ha, your majesty, very firm." Meanwhile, the poor ambassador hides his swollen hand behind a sleeve, praying for ice. But it wasn't just about strength, it was timing. Imagine your Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria standing at a military review. You stick your hand out to a general, but the man, flustered, bows instead of taking it. Suddenly you're left dangling, palm hovering in mid-air, while an entire army watches. That kind of pause echoes louder than any cannon. A quirky tidbit comes from the Russian court, where one visiting Persian diplomat reportedly kissed the wrong hand, the hand of a junior noble instead of the Tsar himself. The room gasped as though lightning had struck. Protocol demanded silence, but you know the gossip mill spun all night. Was the diplomat blind or sly or simply unlucky? We'll never know. And then there are the names. Oh, the names. A monarch meeting dignitaries had to remember titles, family ties, even past alliances. But nerves scrambled brains. One English king addressed a Dutch ambassador by the wrong title, effectively demoting him in public. The ambassador stiffened, then retaliated by calling the king Your Highness instead of Your Majesty. That's the handshake equivalent of subtweeting in 1720. You sense how every movement is amplified in these moments. Imagine sweaty palms inside embroidered gloves, the faint squeak of leather, the breathless silence as courtiers lean forward to judge. One slip, too hard, too soft, too quick, and you've become gossip fodder. If this were modern life, it would be like shaking hands at a job interview while accidentally saying, "Nice to meet you, Steve," when his name is Greg. Except Steve controls an army. There's even the tale of Napoleon, who despised handshakes altogether. He preferred nods or salutes. But once, caught off guard by a British officer extending a hand, he grasped it brusquely, muttered something unintelligible, and stalked off. To the British, it looked like contempt. To Napoleon, it was just awkward improv. Historians still debate whether that moment soured the meeting or whether everyone laughed later. The body betrays you in such times. One king, nervous before meeting the Pope, reportedly had trembling hands so obvious that the Pope gently placed his own hand over them, like calming a scared child. Dignified? Not exactly. Memorable? Absolutely. You can almost feel the blush creeping under the powdered makeup. And then there's the accidental comedy of cultural clashes. In some courts, a bow was deep, in others, shallow. In one legendary encounter, a Japanese envoy bowed nearly to the floor, while the European monarch stuck his hand straight out for a shake. The envoy's forehead nearly smacked the royal knuckles. Gasps, laughter, and a lifetime of embarrassment followed. If you've ever offered a high five that wasn't returned, you know the burn. Now magnify that feeling by tapestries, trumpets, and the eyes of 200 courtiers. You'd wish for the floor to open beneath you. The thing is, you can't control these blunders. The more you try to nail the perfect gesture, the more your fingers twitch. You remember the soup spills from earlier. Now your palms are clammy, your sleeve too tight, your name dangerously close to vanishing from memory. And the king, watching you with that sharp gaze, knows exactly how nervous you are. So you extend your hand, or maybe you bow, and either way you pray the moment ends quickly. Because history has taught you one truth. Nobody remembers the treaties signed, but they will always remember the king who missed a handshake and stood like a statue while everyone else panicked. You edge away from the stiff handshake rooms and slip into another gallery where velvet curtains brush against gilded moldings. Tonight, the stage isn't a handshake or a spoon. It's your own wardrobe. You tug nervously at your breeches, hoping the seams hold, because one rip in front of 200 courtiers will echo louder than any trumpet fanfare. Clothes in royal courts were not simply clothes, they were theatre. Every pleat shouted power, every jewel implied dominance, and every stitch was another chance for disaster. Imagine it's coronation day, and your crown fits perfectly, but the stockings beneath your silk robes sag like wet laundry. Suddenly, you're less divinely anointed and more tired uncle at a wedding. A mainstream historical fact plants itself here. King Charles II of England popularized the long vest and breeches combo in the 1660s, turning fashion into royal propaganda. He wanted elegance, but the truth is that those breeches often split during dancing. More than one noble was caught red-faced, clutching at seams while fiddlers pretended not to notice. Now tilt your head to a fringe tidbit. Marie Antoinette once wore a towering wig so high it nearly brushed the chandeliers at Versailles. Hidden inside were ribbons, miniature ships, even bird cages. On one infamous night, her creation toppled sideways mid-curtsy, and the Queen had to pretend nothing was wrong while courtiers whispered behind their fans. Imagine bowing gracefully while carrying a birdcage on your head, only to have it slide into your neighbor's soup. You shuffle forward and your slippers squeak on polished stone. Wardrobe malfunctions weren't just embarrassing, they could be political. Queen Victoria's crinoline skirts were so wide that she once knocked over a side table stacked with delicate porcelain. She tried to keep composure, but the crash shattered the unshakable majesty vibe. Historians still argue whether that one dinner inspired designers to rethink hoop skirts, or whether everyone simply learned to keep tables further away. Even coronations weren't safe. At the lavish crowning of George IV, his elaborate robes were so heavy that he stumbled on the steps, arms flailing, crown askew. Courtiers rushed forward as if saving a man drowning in velvet. He later complained the garments weighed more than a knight's armor. You can almost feel the sweaty panic beneath those brocade layers, and the servants silently praying the seams wouldn't burst. And then there were wigs. Oh, the wigs! A king of Denmark once sneezed so forcefully that his powdered wig slipped forward, covering his eyes. He carried on as if nothing happened, speaking blindly while courtiers tried not to collapse in laughter. If you've ever had your hat blown off in the wind, you know the pain. Only multiply it by the presence of ambassadors scribbling notes about your dignity. One monarch in Spain insisted on boots polished so intensely that they squeaked with each step. At a solemn funeral procession, the squeaking echoed comically through the cathedral. Some whispered he resembled a mischievous mouse more than a grieving ruler. You imagine trying to keep a straight face while your footwear squeaks like a chew toy. And then came the danger of jewels. Heavy crowns slipped, necklaces tangled. A Russian empress once leaned forward too quickly, and her diamond tiara tumbled onto the floor. Gasps filled the hall. It was like watching a chandelier collapse. Servants scrambled, everyone panicked about scratches, and she, red-faced, had to sit as if this were a perfectly normal part of ceremony. But sometimes accidents became legend. Peter the Great, eager to show his modern European wardrobe, wore such tight boots that he had to be carried after a parade. His stubbornness became a kind of comedy routine, whispered in taverns. Historians still debate whether he was more humiliated or simply too stubborn to admit pain. You can almost smell the starch in the collars, the choking powder, the faint whiff of perfume trying to mask sweat. And you realize royals were prisoners of their wardrobes. Every extra ribbon was another chance to snag, every extra buckle another chance to break. One final image lingers, a grand masquerade ball in Vienna where a prince's mask slipped off mid-dance, revealing his flushed, sweaty face. Instead of mystery, he looked like a tired baker after a long shift. Courtiers pretended not to notice, but gossip roared louder than the orchestra. If you've ever walked out of a bathroom with tissue stuck to your shoe, you know the feeling. You sit there tugging at your imaginary cuffs, grateful for elastic waistbands and sneakers. Because once upon a time, a single popped button could decide whether people whispered about you as majestic or as the king who mooned half the court. You follow the hush of the palace out toward the stone arches where straw scatters underfoot and warm, animal breath fogs the cold morning air. The stables are alive, hooves shifting, harness bells flicking, and somewhere a groom humming the same two notes because even servants fear silence in places where the floor remembers every misstep. You slide past a tapestry showing a perfect royal hunt and immediately trip over reality. A spaniel wriggling under a bench with something shiny in its mouth that, judging by the shrieks, used to belong to a duchess. Animals were part of the royal stage set, just as much as chandeliers and silver. Louis XIV didn't only choreograph menus. He curated the famous menagerie at Versailles, a living gallery of exotic beasts meant to dazzle envoys who thought they'd seen everything. Lions, ostriches, antelopes, you name it. It strutted there at one point, as if the king had subscribed to the world's weirdest zoo of the month club. And long before that, English monarchs kept a menagerie at the Tower of London, an elephant gifted to Henry III, polar bears who fished in the Thames on chains, the occasional leopard glaring like a tax audit. All very impressive, right up until something with teeth decided it had notes on protocol. You step into a banquet hall at the exact second a lapdog, plumed tail quivering with righteousness, decides an ambassador's calf looks like a treasonous sausage. The nip is quick, the yelp is quicker. The dog's jeweled collar flashes as it scampers under the Queen's chair, where no treaty may follow. Courtiers freeze, then unfreeze into frantic politeness. So brave of you, Your Excellency, to bleed so discreetly. The Queen calls the dog Angel, which is diplomatic code for do not mention the bite. Historians still argue whether a notorious bite like this, there are several candidates across the centuries, was a genuine accident or a covert flex, a way of saying, we see your envoy, and we have tiny fanged opinions. Of course, sometimes the animals caused trouble outside the dining room. Picture a coronation parade, the sort that turns a city into a river of ribbons. You mount a glossy charger trained to bow on command. Trumpets flare. The horse decides the trumpets are demon geese and launches into a sideways moonwalk that would impress a dance instructor and horrify a bishop. You cling to the pommel, crown wobbling, while grooms sprint like panicked commas trying to tidy a sentence gone wrong. Was it fireworks, incense, an unlucky gust of velvet? Pick your culprit, because coronation horses have bolted more than once, and the chronicles never fully agree. Historians still argue whether a particular runaway steed in a famous procession bolted because of over-polishing the armor, too shiny, too spookable, or because someone dropped a ceremonial mace with the comic timing of a drum roll. Hunting displays were just as risky. A king invites foreign guests to witness falconry, very majestic, very look how civilized our predation can be. You stand with the party as a hooded falcon shivers with anticipation. The hood lifts, the bird launches, and then keeps going. Past the hedges, over the roofline, straight toward the pastry kitchen, as if summoned by lemon tarts. Pages scatter. The royal falconer runs like a man whose pension is diving out of sight, and the visiting duke politely murmurs that in his country the birds return immediately, like well-trained in-laws. That's joke one, by the way. Very gentle, very pastry-forward. And the monkeys? Oh, the monkeys. Courts collected them like conversation pieces, tiny, dressed in ribbons, unsettlingly clever. One afternoon, a marmoset perches on a mantel, eyes glittering with curiosity or perhaps with criminal intent. A lady-in-waiting laughs, leans forward, and the monkey lifts a string of pearls with a thief's touch. In a blink, it's across the room, chattering triumphantly from a curtain rod while 4 grown men wobble on chairs and a 5th tries to bribe it with candied almonds. Did this heist target a queen or a powerful duchess? Accounts clash the way versions of a family story do after holidays. Either way, the court had to pretend it was adorable. The way you pretend your friend's toddler's art isn't a critical attack on your wallpaper. Quirky tidbit secured. Pets wandered everywhere. Cats in libraries, parrots in map rooms, greyhounds that managed to nap directly on ceremonial capes. At one solemn swearing-in, a parrot belonging to a visiting noble interrupted the oath with an impeccable imitation of a butler coughing, followed by, "More pie." The room fought a wave of laughter the way sailors fight a tide, and you, should you ever take a solemn oath, now fear baked goods will haunt you. Somewhere a clerk scribbled interruption by pi in the margin, a little human smudge on otherwise immaculate vellum. Even the smarter animals outwitted etiquette. Royal elephants, rare but unforgettable, could be the pride of a court, guided through gardens with unbelievable gentleness. Yet give an elephant a procession and one brass band too many, and suddenly you have several tons of diplomatic incident deciding it prefers the lily pond. It's hard to look majestic when you're ankle-deep in lilies, crowns sliding like a saucer on your head, while musicians abandon trumpets for lifeguard duties, joke two lands delicately by the pond's edge. Inside, dogs snored beneath thrones, occasionally punctuating treaties with a yip as if voting. You remember the wardrobe squeaks from earlier? Combine that with dog nails clacking on marble and you get the soundtrack of statecraft. Squeak, click, click, awkward cough, quill scratch, distant lion complaining about breakfast. And because some monarchs loved their pets more visibly than they loved protocol, a few allowed creatures to waddle right onto the stage. Queen Victoria doted on her spaniel Dash. Other rulers let pugs or papillons warm their feet during councils. It sounds cozy until a minister delivers a grave report and the pug decides its zoomies o'clock. Occasionally, the animal chaos cut through tension in miraculous ways. A notoriously stiff state dinner loosens the second a kitten, smuggled in by a maid to catch mice, pops out of a fruit arrangement with an expression like a saint caught stealing. The First Lord of whatever chuckles, the Queen hides a smile behind an ostrich feather fan, and suddenly the roast swan tastes less like cardboard and more like forgiveness. You think back to those soup disasters and realize that, unlike humans, animals don't pretend. They aren't worried about forks. Weirdly, that honesty sometimes saved the mood. But it could also sting. An ambassador once bowed so low to a monarch's hound, mistaking it in a dim salon for a symbolic animal statue, that he kissed the dog's snoot. The dog took it with royal calm. The room, alas, combusted quietly. Historians still argue whether the man misread some whispered instruction or whether a rival nudged him forward at the worst possible moment. Either way, he left with dog hair on his lips and a reputation that followed him like a bell on a cat collar. Joke 3. Gentle, furry, mortifying. You pass back through the stables where steam rises from horse flanks like fog over a lake. Somewhere a groom sings to a jittery mare. Somewhere a parrot is bargaining for tarts. You realize that even in palaces designed to deny chaos, life insisted on padding in on soft paws and clattering hooves. The great painted hunts on the walls promised control. The actual hunts and dinners and coronations delivered something closer to slapstick. And beneath all the laughter and panic sits a mainstream truth. Courts displayed animals to advertise dominion over nature, but the beasts kept reminding everyone that nature files no paperwork. You wipe imaginary straw from your sleeve and slip back toward the quiet corridors, thinking how a monkey with pearls or a horse with stage fright could tilt an entire evening. Remember the soup steam curling wigs, the squeaky boots, the handshake dangling in midair? Add a determined lapdog to that list and you've got the real royal syllabus, survival, with a side of fur. You slide back inside, brushing straw from your cuffs, and the chatter shifts from hooves and barking to the slippery trick of tongues. If clothes betrayed kings and dogs nipped at calves, then words, oh words, were daggers wrapped in velvet. You stand in a hall lined with portraits, each one of a ruler who looks perfectly composed. But if you lean close, you might hear the echo of a syllable mangled so badly that it shook alliances. Language was the tightrope of diplomacy. One mainstream fact: when royals traveled or welcomed ambassadors, They were expected to sprinkle greetings in the guest's tongue, a symbolic nod that meant, "I value you." But the risk? Mispronounce a phrase, and suddenly you've declared your mother is a goat instead of "blessed be your kingdom." Take poor Queen Victoria. Her court prided itself on cosmopolitan elegance, but even she struggled with guttural German phrases. At one banquet, she attempted a toast in French and reportedly slurred a phrase that could be interpreted as either "to eternal friendship" or "to eternal onions." The French ambassador smiled tightly, deciding perhaps onions were noble too. Historians still argue whether this mistranslation was exaggerated by gossipy courtiers or genuinely recorded, but the story lingers like a garlic breath at the wrong dinner. And then there's the classic case of Tsar Nicholas I trying to impress a Spanish envoy by attempting a few lines in Spanish. Instead of honoring the envoy's king, Nicholas accidentally proclaimed admiration for a horse. Imagine nodding gravely, applauding politely, while inwardly wondering whether you'd just been compared to livestock. That's faux pas number one. But fringe tidbits spice the tale. In Renaissance Italy, one duke's slip of the tongue led to an uproar when he mistakenly announced his guest's daughter as his own wife. The court gasped, the musicians faltered, and the duke, realizing too late, tried to cover with laughter. The girl burst into tears, the mother fainted, and the evening went down in local legend as the banquet of accidental betrothal. You can almost hear the frantic whispers. Did he mean it? Does this count legally? You step closer to a gilded mirror, watching your own lips move as though practicing, because names especially were treacherous. A single mispronounced title could undo months of careful diplomacy. One British monarch once greeted a visiting Scandinavian noble with the wrong patronymic, turning him from son of greatness to son of a shoemaker. The poor man stiffened like a frostbitten tree, and the treaty discussions never quite thawed. Joke 1. Imagine negotiating global peace talks today and opening with, "Good to see you, Mr. Plummer." Sometimes the errors were musical. King George IV, eager to impress, sang a short verse of an Italian aria before dinner. He forgot the lyrics halfway through and filled the gap with nonsense syllables that sounded suspiciously like mooing. Courtiers clapped politely while one Italian envoy whispered to another, "He serenades cows." Historians still debate whether George knew he'd botched it or thought he'd invented a new genre. And then there were interpreters, those unsung heroes who could either save or sabotage a ruler. At one Ottoman court session, the Sultan gave a poetic speech, but the interpreter, flustered, simplified it to, "He says, 'Welcome, sit.'" Guests looked confused, the grandeur shrank, and somewhere the original poetry wept. Yet sometimes interpreters twisted things deliberately. There are stories of envoys adding extra compliments to make a monarch seem more eloquent, or trimming insults to avoid duels. Historians still argue whether these edits changed actual treaties or just saved a few dinners. The most humiliating? Accidental insults in front of entire crowds. One Habsburg archduke, trying to toast an English princess, mangled her name so completely that it came out sounding like "ugly duckling." The orchestra struck up in panic to drown the laughter, but you know how gossip moves. By breakfast, half the empire was quacking behind closed doors. Joke 2 lands with feathers. Sometimes the missteps weren't verbal, but written. Monarchs drafted letters with flowery openings, but sloppy spelling betrayed them. A Spanish king once misspelled the name of a Polish queen in an official missive, changing "most radiant jewel" into "most radiant mule." The letter survives, blotches and all, and you can practically hear the scribe begging forgiveness from the ink bottle itself. And accents. Oh, accents. Even within one language, they tripped rulers. A Scottish monarch addressing English lords spoke so thickly that half the court nodded along without understanding a word. Later, one courtier admitted he thought the king had been reciting a prayer. The king had actually been asking for more ale. Joke 3 bubbles up like the ale itself. Blessed be the kingdom, and yes, refill my pint. As you drift past the portraits, you can almost hear the rehearsals behind the scenes. Princes mumbling foreign phrases to tutors, queens practicing greetings with rosaries in hand, servants mouthing corrections like desperate coaches. And still, under pressure, the words slipped sideways, the syllables betrayed them, and the hall erupted in stifled coughs of laughter. Language gave monarchs power, but it also betrayed them at their most human. Behind the velvet drapery of protocol, they were just people trying to remember names, praying not to toast onions, and hoping their accents wouldn't turn solemn vows into barnyard songs. And you, murmuring along with these ghosts, know the terror of public speaking all too well. At least when you mispronounce something in class or at work, it doesn't threaten to start a war. Probably. You drift down a marble hallway where echoes sharpen every sound, and suddenly you notice it, the way your own footsteps reverberate like a drum roll, daring your stomach to gurgle at the wrong time. In the palaces of Europe, silence wasn't your friend. Silence magnified every sneeze, every hiccup, every squeak of polished shoe leather. And when those noises came from the crowned head of state, oh, the gossip brewed like soup left on the fire. Picture a glittering ball, chandeliers blaze, the air heavy with rosewater and candle smoke. A king rises to give a solemn toast. He clears his throat, except it's not a dignified clearing. It's a ragged, awkward cough that drags on and on. Courtiers freeze, glasses poised in midair, until the queen nervously clinks her ring on the goblet to restart the moment. A mainstream fact anchors you. King James I of England was notorious for hacking coughs and heavy sniffles, worsened by his love of tobacco. Guests learned to politely sip wine whenever he coughed, as if orchestrating a symphony of distraction. Imagine timing your sip to someone else's wheeze. Welcome to royal etiquette. But bodily rebellion wasn't limited to coughs. One French queen sneezed mid-curtsy so violently that she nearly toppled forward into a duke's arms. Perfumed lace handkerchiefs fluttered like surrender flags, and the moment burned itself into memory. Historians still argue whether this infamous sneeze was due to pollen-heavy garlands or an ill-timed snuff pinch offered by a cheeky maid. Either way, the story sneezed its way into legend. Now tilt your head toward fringe territory. Medieval rulers believed certain bodily noises had prophetic weight. Chroniclers record that a Hungarian king, struck by hiccups during a coronation banquet, declared them an omen of military victory. Courtiers dutifully applauded between his hicks, but you can imagine the muffled laughter behind embroidered sleeves. Imagine your hiccups being so forceful they count as a war declaration. Of course, the stomach was the greatest traitor. You sit through a 5-hour feast, course after course, while silence sits like an iron crown. And then, the royal belly growls. Not a polite rumble, but the kind that echoes like a bassoon through the marble. An emperor once tried to cover his midsection with his cloak, as though muffling the sound, but courtiers heard it anyway. An ambassador joked, quietly, that the emperor's stomach was negotiating its own treaty. Joke 1 lands right in the gut. And then there were smells. Perfumes were meant to dazzle, but sometimes they overpowered the room like chemical warfare. Louis XV's court was so drenched in musk and ambergris that foreign envoys reportedly staggered outside mid-conversation to breathe. On the flip side, some rulers, like Peter the Great, were accused of showing up reeking of sweat and spirits. Historians still debate whether Peter ignored perfumes deliberately as a mark of rugged masculinity or whether he simply didn't care. Either way, courtiers learned to bow quickly and step back even quicker. Sometimes the humiliation came not from excess, but from failure. Queen Elizabeth I, famed for layers of sweet-smelling pomanders and scented gloves, once arrived at a banquet where the overpowering mix of roses and musk made her sneeze repeatedly through the first course. Guests dutifully pretended it was divine music, though one court jester later quipped that God himself must have allergies. And then, oh yes, flatulence. No one wanted to admit it, but it haunted palaces like a ghost. One Tudor noble supposedly passed gas while kneeling before Queen Elizabeth. Mortified, he fled court and hid at his estate for years. When he finally returned, Elizabeth greeted him by saying, "We have quite forgot the fart," quirky tidbit carved forever into history. Sometimes noises sparked confusion. A king of Sweden, known for his booming sneezes, once startled guards so badly they thought an assassin's gun had fired. Swords clashed, panic rippled, and by the time order returned, the monarch was wiping his nose with regal disdain. Joke 2. Imagine a sneeze strong enough to trigger national defense. Even music couldn't always hide the embarrassments. At a Russian ball, a Tsarina's laughter snort, high-pitched, nasal, unstoppable, echoed so loudly that the orchestra faltered. She tried to disguise it with coughing, but the sound spread like wildfire across the court. Some claimed she had a cold, others claimed the punch had been too strong. Historians still argue whether that moment was charming humanity or scandalous loss of dignity. And then there were accidents of wardrobe colliding with smell. In one story, a French duke doused himself in so much clove oil to mask a previous mishap that guests nicknamed him the Walking Pharmacy. His cape wafted so aggressively that birds reportedly avoided his garden for weeks. Joke 3. When even pigeons ghost you, your perfume budget might need revisiting. You lean against the cold wall, realizing how little control anyone truly had. Royals could dictate wars, commission palaces, summon poets, but they couldn't command their own noses or stomachs. A single hiccup could reduce solemnity to slapstick. A mistimed sneeze could turn a coronation into a comedy sketch. And in the fragile theatre of etiquette, those noises mattered. So you step back into the flickering torchlight, grateful for the quiet hum of your own fan at home. Because at least when your stomach growls or you sneeze during a movie, it doesn't echo across marble halls and into history books. Unless, of course, you're crowned first. You wander deeper into the palace, and the air thickens, not with incense or roses this time, but with the unmistakable tang of wine-soaked breath. The chandeliers flicker, not from draught, but from laughter that teeters on the edge of slurred. Tonight you've stumbled into the banquet hall at its most dangerous hour, after the third cup, when etiquette limps and kings forget their crowns aren't helmets for tavern brawls. Feasting was always political theatre, but once goblets flowed unchecked, that stage tilted into comedy. A mainstream fact grounds you. Henry VIII of England, famous for both appetite and temper, often drank heavily during feasts. Chroniclers note that his red face and booming voice sometimes spilled into insults, turning polite dinners into shouting matches. Once, after too many cups of sack, he challenged a French envoy to a wrestling match right there on the palace floor. The envoy wisely declined, though you can almost see the courtiers praying no one lost a tooth. And yet Henry wasn't alone. The pattern repeated across courts. Charles II of Spain, fragile and sickly, once had to be half-carried from a banquet after drinking far more than his frail body could manage. Courtiers pretended it was a fainting spell, but behind fans they whispered about royal gulps. Historians still argue whether his frequent collapses were medical or a symptom of misjudged indulgence. You edge toward the long oak table where goblets glint like traps. One quirky tidbit rises. Tsar Peter the Great loved toasting so much that he created a drunken court with an official mock bishop of mischief. At these feasts, nobles were forced to drink until they staggered. Some laughed, some cried, and some ended up face first in bowls of cabbage soup. Imagine being knighted into what was basically a medieval frat house. And then, of course, the accidental slips. King Christian VII of Denmark once grew so tipsy at a gala that he serenaded his guests with bawdy sailors' songs instead of the expected hymns. Courtiers clapped politely, faces frozen like painted masks, while one bishop whispered furiously about the devil's influence. Joke 1. The devil apparently preferred sea shanties. Wine made some rulers weep. One Austrian archduke, at a solemn wedding feast, became so emotional under the influence that he sobbed loudly into the cake, soaking the sugar roses. The bride smiled bravely, guests dabbed at their noses, and the orchestra played louder, as though volume could erase frosting tears. Historians still debate whether this was touching sensitivity or catastrophic weakness. Either way, the cake never recovered. You slip toward the throne itself, and there you see it. A monarch slouched sideways, crown slipping like a party hat. George IV of England once drank so heavily that he forgot lines in his own coronation speech, mumbling gibberish until the archbishop quietly skipped ahead. Guests later recalled the king swaying like a mast in storm winds. If you've ever given a presentation after too many espressos, you know the vibe. Multiply it by a golden crown and the eyes of Europe. Sometimes the drunken slips were literal. An emperor in the Holy Roman Empire toppled straight off his ceremonial chair mid-toast, legs kicking like a beetle. Courtiers rushed to prop him up, but the crown had already rolled across the marble floor, clanging like a dropped pan. One servant later joked that the crown bowed to the floor before the emperor did. Joke 2 clangs right beside the crown. But perhaps the most humiliating, secrets spilt, wine loosened tongues faster than scribes could catch up. At one banquet, a Spanish king drunkenly confessed which nobles he actually despised, naming names between gulps. Laughter froze, nobles exchanged murderous glances, and the court never forgot. Historians still argue whether this rant was exaggerated by chroniclers or whether it truly set off feuds lasting generations. Either way, the banquet became known as the Night of Burning Ears. And yet, there's a strange tenderness in it. Monarchs were supposed to be marble statues of composure, but in wine you glimpse their humanity, messy, sloppy, unfiltered. A French queen once giggled uncontrollably after 3 cups, hiccuping through her vows of loyalty, while her ladies-in-waiting pinched her sides to quiet her. If you've ever had a friend laugh snort into a soda, you know the helplessness. Joke 3 hiccups right into the goblet. You pause at the edge of the hall, the torches dimming. Around you, nobles pretend nothing is amiss, smoothing their sleeves as their ruler snores gently against a velvet cushion. Servants clear dishes with exaggerated quiet. The orchestra plays on, as though music could disguise the unmistakable fact. Etiquette has collapsed under spilled wine. And you, standing there, realize how dangerous these slips could be. A single drunken insult might spark a duel, a war, or at least a lifetime of mockery. Behind the laughter lurks fear, because when a monarch fell from dignity, the whole court trembled with them. So you step away from the table, leaving the snores and goblets behind. You can almost smell the sour tang of wine mixing with candle smoke. And you whisper to yourself a vow every king should have taken: never drink more than you can bow with. You leave the wine-splashed hall behind and move toward the places where etiquette isn't just dented by hiccups or lapdogs. It collapses like a paper crown in rain. The corridors funnel you into chambers where the choreography of power, drilled for months, fails in a heartbeat. You can still smell spilled sack, clove oil, and that last puff of snuff that made a queen sneeze. You can still hear the squeak of boots and the whisper of a monkey clutching pearls. Now watch what happens when the whole pageant tears at the seams. Take a mainstream fact carved deep into the stones of Westminster. At the coronation of William the Conqueror in 1066, the congregation shouted assent so loudly that Norman guards outside panicked, thinking a riot had erupted. They drew swords, torches flared, and nearby buildings went up in flames. Inside, bishops tried to keep praying while people bolted for the doors. Ceremony turned to chaos, like a solemn wedding where the fire alarm erupts and the ring-bearer sprints for the cake. You feel the heat, see the smoke curling like that old soup steam that once wilted wigs, and realize how thin the line is between grandeur and farce. Historians still argue whether the guards misheard the acclamation or seized the moment to cow the city. Either way, it was a coronation scored by crackling timber. Now slide forward to another crown, another rupture. In 1804, Napoleon seized the laurel from Pope Pius VII's hands and set it on his own head, upstaging the very idea of papal authority. That wasn't a sneeze or a squeaky shoe, that was protocol shattered on purpose. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath, the rustle of silk like wind through a wheat field. The Pope blinked, the world recalibrated. Even now, scholars fence politely over motive, theatre or necessity. You suspect both. Napoleon, after all, loved a stage, and what better spotlight than a stolen coronation beat? Joke one leans in softly. It's the historical version of blowing out someone else's birthday candles, just with more embroidery and Latin. Meanwhile, etiquette wars didn't just break indoors. In 1661, London, the Spanish and French ambassadors fought a street battle over whose coach would precede the other in a ceremonial procession. Men died over inches of cobblestone and the order of wheels. The affair of the coaches, they called it later, with the same energy people now reserve for naming group chats, except this thread had pistols. Louis XIV forced Spain to apologize, and precedents tilted like a chessboard tipped by an impatient hand. Imagine a modern red carpet where publicists duel with umbrellas to get their star to the front. Now replace the umbrellas with swords and the hashtags with treaties. Inside courts, chairs held their own battlefields. The right to sit, a simple stool or a cushioned chair, could ignite feuds that boiled for decades. The French droit du tabouret let certain duchesses sit on folding stools in the Queen's presence. Others had to stand until legs trembled like blown glass. A quirky tidbit. One lady allegedly carried her stool folded under her skirts, ready to unfurl it like a weapon the second protocol allowed. Picture a genteel gunfighter with a collapsible seat. If a steward placed the wrong chair by the wrong person, duels could follow before dessert. And then there were ceremonies that began perfect and ended sideways. George IV, whom you've already seen drowning in velvet and squeaks, held a splendiferous coronation in 1821 that famously barred Queen Caroline from Westminster Abbey. She arrived at the doors and found them slammed. Boos rose from the crowd outside. Inside, pearls jingled uneasily. The pageant went on, yet the snub stained the gloss like wine on silk. Protocol didn't just wobble, it weaponized itself. You smell the powder, the lilies, the sweat of soldiers bracing for unrest, and you remember the earlier handshake left dangling in air. Only now the whole marriage is left dangling, in public, forever. Across the channel, the field of the cloth of gold in 1520 promised magnificence without misstep. Two kings, Henry VIII of England and Francis III of France, dined, tilted, dazzled. Then Henry, buoyed by bravado and perhaps by banquet spirits, challenged Francis to wrestle. Francis flipped him in a flash. A treaty didn't shatter, but Henry's dignity took a pratfall audible from Calais to Canterbury. Court wits spread the tale like butter on hot bread. The English lion pinned by a French fox. Joke two pats the grass. Somewhere a herald quietly painted "No wrestling" on the etiquette sign. Sometimes the collapse wore tragedy's mask. At Nicholas II's coronation festivities in 1896, a gift distribution at Kodinka Field turned into a stampede that killed and injured thousands. No joke, no wink, just a shadow that fell over a brand new crown. Etiquette could not paper over grief. The imperial couple's attendance at a ball that evening deepened the public wound. You keep your voice low here, a reminder that the theatre of monarchy stood only as long as the audience did, that order isn't a costume you can pin back together after it tears. Not all implosions were grand. Some were small detonations with aftershocks. In Rome, ambassadors once fought over who received precedence near the Pope's dais. Constables shoved, plumes tangled, trumpets died mid-note. A mass meant to display unity dissolved into flustered whispers and reorganized chairs, the ecclesiastical version of musical chairs but with reputations as the stakes. Historians still argue whether these precedence wars truly influenced policy or merely bruised egos that later sought revenge in subtler halls. You suspect bruised egos write long memos. And because you're already feeling the floor give way, recall our earlier creatures and clothes and words. A monkey with pearls, a wig migrating across a royal forehead, onions toasted by accident, the parrot asking for pie, the drunk crown rolling. Those were comic rehearsal drills compared to the nights when an entire court misread its own script. Think of a torchlit mask where one dancer misses a step, then 3, then 20, and suddenly the choreography becomes a tangle of capes and elbows. That's a crowning gone awry, a procession turned skirmish, a banquet where two dukes draw steel over which side of the table counts as right. You slide along a wall of portraits and, for a heartbeat, every painted eye seems to look away in embarrassment. Protocol promises a world so tidy that soup never splashes, dogs never bite, boots never squeak, and kings never hiccup. But you've walked the louder truth. In real courts, bows met fists, sacred oil sloshed, canopies snapped their poles, and chairs became declarations. Joke 3 bows and sidesteps. If you ever time travel to a royal ceremony, bring earplugs, comfortable shoes, and maybe a collapsible stool. Just in case you accidentally outrank someone and need to sit very quickly. And then the hall stills. The floor is the same polished stone you've crossed all night. The air carries the same beeswax and breath of roses. Only now you understand that etiquette is a stage set held up by pins and hope, and that the most embarrassing moments, the ones courts try to pretend away, are the ones that prove everyone under silk and ermine is still bewilderingly, beautifully human. Let the torches dim a little, the long corridors narrowing into a single soft hallway where your steps slow and the night remembers how to breathe. The clatter of cutlery fades first like rain moving off a roofline. Then the murmur of courtiers thins into something gentler than a hush, the way a theatre empties until only velvet and dust remain. You can set down the crown you've been carrying in your imagination. It was heavy, and you held it long enough. Feel the cool of stone giving way to the woolly warmth of a rug, the kind that forgives tired feet. The dogs that once romped through banquets are only sleepy shapes now, sighing into their paws. Somewhere a last candle gutters, not failing, just deciding the story can end without it. The perfumes mellow into clean linen and a whisper of old books. Even the ghost of a trumpet accepts the quiet, placing itself carefully back into its case. Your breath finds an easier rhythm, and the palace, no longer performing, becomes a house with lights out. The chairs that sparked arguments simply wait like patient trees. The crowns stop wobbling and become bowls for cool moonlight. The words that tangled in mouths settle into meaning again, small and kind, the way names sound when spoken by friends. If a floor once shook under parade hooves, now it holds steady for a single pair of unhurried footsteps. Yours, crossing toward a door left slightly open to the night. Step through and let the air lift the last scraps of laughter and blush and surprise. They were good company while they lasted. You learned what you needed, that even the grandest rooms forgive mistakes, and that sleep arrives more easily when the script is allowed to crumple. Close the door with a fingertip. Let the quiet fold around you like silk turned to cloud. Nothing more is required. The night will keep everything safe.